Welcome, Zsuzsa Gille. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. And yesterday was an amazingly rich day. I learned a lot. So I'm going to share my screen. And hopefully everyone can see this. I was recently asked to write about the effect of global and transnational sociology on how we study waste. And it struck me that basically both waste studies and global studies are interdisciplinary fields. And we're going to talk a little bit about the nature of this field tomorrow morning in the keynote panel. They are both relatively new. They both present novel theoretical and methodological approaches, and they both respond to pressing social problems. So what I want to do today is focus more briefly on the thematic dialogue that exists between these two fields, and then spend most of my time on a methodological dialogue, illustrating how we might solve certain methodological challenges through my own historical work. So most focus in this overlap between global studies and waste studies has focused on waste distribution, waste export, illegal or legal, as well as waste treatment. So the problem here was that it tends to reflect a kind of untheoretical definition of waste to the extent that it only focuses on already produced waste. Here, the key topics are international waste trade, treaties and policy diffusion, the role of multinational corporations, as well as supranational organizations, roles in privatizing and professionalizing municipal waste collection, the effect of all of these on informal and precarious waste labor. I find that global waste production, in contrast to waste distribution, has received much less attention in this overlap between global studies and waste studies, but I'm gonna share with you what already exists. We now have an increasing recognition that waste generation is just as transnational as commodity generation. So we can think about not just commodity and value chains, but also waste chains. What already exists in the scholarship are multinational corporations outsourcing the most toxic or most waste intensive part of their production process. Oh, I said the global studies. To the global south, I apologize. Waste-related codes of conduct and other voluntary environmental standards that corporations implement in the global north do not necessarily translate into higher environmental performance further down the supply chain. And then there has also been some studies on corporations' lobbying efforts against environmental regulation. A second area in which global waste production has been attended to is in the realm of consumer waste. There has been some focus on the rise of the so-called global middle class. And while it's recognized that rising consumption doesn't necessarily increase waste, this has been the fact pretty much everywhere where scholars have looked. They focused on contributing factors such as the relative and increasing inexpensiveness of consumer goods, the built-in obsolescence, the lack of regulation of material composition, that is a problem when you bring in new types of material compositions and waste that the existing regulation and infrastructure cannot deal with. And there have been some studies focusing on the ineffectiveness of waste reduction and reuse efforts globally. They mention here things like the Jevons paradox, recycling, feel-good reuse. Jevons paradox is the idea, for those of you who are not familiar with the term, that when you recycle or use products that are made out of reconstituted salvage materials, you feel good about it, so you actually end up consuming more. A third area, and I'm not going to have time to go into this, in global waste production is food waste. I'd be happy to come back to this. This is probably the most theoretically sophisticated part of that overlap between global studies and waste studies, where you have studies on food aid, on retail power, etc. But as I mentioned, what I really want to focus on is the methodological dialogue between global studies and waste studies. In order to understand what this dialogue is about, I wanted to remind you of a few limitations that scholars have identified in traditional social science epistemology and methodology. The first one we call methodological nationalism. For waste studies, this has meant that waste policies that have been assumed to be driven only by domestic factors, domestic civil society, the national government. But the problem is that while the nation state is certainly relevant, the ever thicker inter, trans, and supranational relations sociologists have identified exert novel, so not just more, but novel types of pressures on national policies and waste practices. So a challenge here is to study waste issues by avoiding this methodological nationalism and always looking at possible connections outside the nation state. The second shortcoming is the problem with quantitative and qualitative cross-national comparison. The validity of these comparisons is much reduced by the fact that when you want to compare, statistically speaking, you have to assume that the units that you compare are independent. Of course, we can no longer assume, empirically speaking, such independence. And so comparing nations and correlating their records in environmental policies or their waste data, let's say with GDP per capita or other variables, will necessarily yield skewed results since wastes are unevenly mobile, as are producers who generate wastes, and the policies affecting those data are also driven and informed by trends and supranational actors such as the European Union or multinational corporations. I just want to mention here that this is one of the key problems I have with, for example, ecological modernization series going to the environmental Kuznets curve that correlates, let's say, GDP or GDP per capita with the carbon footprint or other environmental effects, because in fact, it doesn't take into consideration the kinds of waste and polluting production processes that are outsourced to other countries that, of course, do not make it into these cross-national comparisons. The third methodological shortcoming that global studies started to take on is that we can no longer take for granted the classical scale or hierarchy of the local, the national, the global, and the supranational. These scales are no longer fully nested within each other as Russian dolls, rather assess, and many others have shown, the functions of what we used to call the national now shift both to the supra and the subnational. And there's an additional problem here, I think, for waste studies scholars that Josh Lapovsky demonstrated in his study of electronic waste, where he looked at the waste output of a single smelter in the United States. And what have found is that its byproducts and waste products are actually bigger than post-consumer electronic waste for the whole of US. So seemingly this is one smelter, which would be at the level of the local, right, subnational scale. But in terms of its impact, it's practically supranational. So what I want to focus is giving you an example of how I have tried to take these methodological limitations into consideration in my historical work. And you might have seen my work in other contexts, grappling with what I call the transnational or the global concrete. What I was trying to do all these years is following Michael Burawoy and Doreen Massey, who both identify how in classical social science methodology, we tend to conflate the level of analysis with social scale. So we tended to assume that if you study the local, you can only produce empirically concrete data. But if you want to generate theory, you have to go to the global or macro level. And so Doreen Massey very astutely argues that the concrete, if we understand it as the product of many determinations, can manifest at any scale. So this analytic led me to a study of waste and waste practices, which I consider to be at the level of the concrete, but shed light on the interrelations of Western capitalism and state socialism. So I look at these interrelations at the scale of the global. And what I have done is unearthing first how their modes of waste generation were mutually determining, especially during the Cold War, and how the latter, state socialism, functioned as a source of cheap nature for the former. And the concept of cheap nature should be familiar to you from Jason Moore's concept of the Capitalocene, which my work is in direct conversation with. So what I'm taking with this move is taking the Capital-Scene's relational approach to its next logical extension, but I'm also trying to avoid its abstractions, which can be seen maybe just as abstract as the concept of the Anthropocene, and we can talk more about this in the Q&A. So basically where I locate my study is, if you look at the levels of analysis, concrete, abstract, and then in the columns, the micro, local, these are social scales. So where I want to be is in the transnational or global concrete. So what I did is I looked at how we might transnationalize my old concept of waste regime, which admittedly was very nation-bound. I think it really did suffer from a kind of methodological nationalism early on. And then what I wanted to do is to infuse these new methodological innovations in my study. And what I have found, and this research is still ongoing, are three types of relationalities between the capitalist West and the socialist East. Here, the most studied aspect of this relationality has been waste trade, mostly, of course, in fact, exclusively from the West to the East. And we heard a wonderful talk about this yesterday in the East German, West German context. The second is the outsourcing of manufacturing of products that have a high waste ratio or that are particularly toxic. And an example of this that I have worked on for many years is producing Agent Orange, which, as you know, was euphemistically called an herbicide in the Vietnam War. And what I have found that an intermediary of Agent Orange was actually produced in socialist Hungary. So there you have a quite an irony. So waste trade, outsourcing. The third one, and I admit that this really is the hardest to study, is what I would call excess waste due to Cold War logic. Basically, we could ask the question that some historians might find ahistorical, is we could ask the question, would Western capitalism, and especially that period that Stefan et al. Call the Great Acceleration, been quite so wasteful, had it not been for the Soviet bloc, which after all produced a kind of Cold War logic that put these two social blocs, not just a competition, not just in terms of the arms race, but also in terms of outcompeting each other in terms of living standards. And maybe what we can ask here is, following those scholars, and there's not much that I found in the literature, maybe you can point me to other sources, is the question of the peace dividend, right? Could we say that if there hadn't been this competition, Western capitalism wouldn't have been quite so wasteful? Could we say that that some of these wastes were also kind of opportunity costs, in the sense that resources could have been spent, not armament or frivolous individual consumption, but could have been used for the fulfillment of human needs, decreasing poverty, and finding and implementing environmentally sane alternatives to toxic production processes. So to close, I coined this concept, and admittedly, this is very tongue-in-cheek, this concept of the Sociolocene, again, in conversation with the Capitalocene, that argues that especially this great acceleration period that Stefan et al. Argues could be seen as a kind of transnational waste regime, in which modes of waste production of Western market economies on the one hand, and centrally planned economies in the Soviet bloc were mutually constitutive. And I'm going to close there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We open up, first receive the applause, and then we open up for comments. You have to raise your hand, remember? And then I will ask you to unmute. Yeah, please go ahead. Jerry, did you have a question?
Yeah, I wasn't aware that I would be my turn so quickly.
Oh, sorry.
But it doesn't matter. Yeah, I have been grappling with a very similar issue in terms of looking at transnational waste, waste chains, as I've called them in some research proposal. Now, I've more conceived this not as one waste regime, but rather as a constellation of waste regimes that are communicating with each other. So it wouldn't it be more fruitful to look at this in terms of a multiple waste regimes interacting?
I think that's an excellent point, and I would be lying if I told you I had not grappled with the same kind of analytical question. I think ultimately the answer to your question has to be empirically driven. Usually, I mean, for example, in the context of market economies and centrally planned economies in the East, we tended to assume that they were so radically different, and I'm not going to talk about those scholars who thought about socialism as just another version of state capitalism, but basically they were considered to be so uniquely constituted that it didn't make sense to put them in the same regime. So the reason why I put them in the same transnational regime is to get away from this methodological nationalism and the idea that the reason why, let's say, centrally planned economies were so allegedly wasteful was because of Marxism, was because the ineptness of the planning bureaucracy. And in fact, what I want to show is that these things were related. I think right now what we need is more showing these interconnections rather than going back to our national silos. So that would be my answer. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, of course. I think we could continue the discussion for another half an hour. I want to allow other people to ask.
Yeah, maybe we can find another opportunity to do so.
Yeah, I will contact you.
And Daniel also has a question.
Thank you very much. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed it, and especially the note about the methodological nationalism. But I would like to ask you if in your research of these higher levels and comparisons, you also encountered the methodological issues growing from differences between disciplines. I mean, you know, kind of engineering, chemists, and then the social people from social sciences coming and, you know, trying to kind of merge these different perspectives and data together. So any idea about this?
Well, and you know, I'm a sociologist. I'm trained as a sociologist, right? So that's the discipline that I speak from, and there we certainly are having a problem with these methodological limitations. I think the fact that both global studies and waste studies are interdisciplinary actually signals to you that we should not, I mean, while we need the disciplinary methodological training, once we put them into practice, especially when our goal is social critique, I think we need to be promiscuous in taking methodological moves from different disciplines and see what fits. I take some from economists, right? Of course, you cannot say that economists would ever take anything from a sociologist or an anthropologist. That I'm yet to see that happen. So the problem is to take from disciplines without bowing down to this disciplinary hierarchy that usually lines up along who is the most positivist, who has the most precise data set, right? Yeah, that would be my kind of roundabout way of answering your question.
Thank you very much.
And I'm be happy to talk to you if you have like specific methodological issues that lead back to disciplinary divisions. I'm really interested in that. So maybe we can extend this conversation at another venue. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
For the moment, there's not any hand raised. Well, now Elizabeth raised her hand. I was going to ask one question to you then. Where are these new ways? Well, this ways to be found. Where should we direct our studies concretely in the field? Like you said, the Cold War excess waste. Where is it to be found that we haven't seen yet?
It's not so much that we haven't seen it. It's just we didn't think of those. So I should have started with this. My definition of waste is any material that we fail to use for the satisfaction of human needs. And I understand that this has a little bit of a Marxist bad taste about it. But if we understand waste as wasted resource, not simply the stuff that we put in landfills or we burn in incinerators, then I think we can look at a whole host of industries and consumer goods, weaponry, et cetera, that are waste. They're not fulfilling human needs. And of course, they do contribute to, to actual material waste that we tend to study.
Thank you. I'll leave the first to Elizabeth and then to Dario.
Just quickly lower my hand, otherwise I'll forget to lower it later. Thank you very much, Professor Gille, for a really interesting talk. I really enjoyed it, and I learned a lot. Actually, I was very interested, and I'm becoming increasingly interested in this idea of the uneven mobility of waste, particularly in relation to, and I'd be grateful for some insight or feedback about this, but particularly in relation to globalized platform economies and the ways in which different kinds of waste streams or regimes are entering into these globalized platform economies. For example, from the ports onto the ships. So I wonder if that's something that you're thinking about in this kind of, well, it's not new, but the project that you're presenting today, and how then can we perhaps even historicize capitalism in that process? Thank you.
Well, that is not something I looked at, and it's possible I'm misunderstanding your question. Are you also suggesting that these wastes are kind of mixed up in new ways? So when you talk about platform economies, can you elaborate?
Well, I'm interested. I mean, I'm currently in Beirut right now, and a year ago, the port exploded with a certain kind of waste, if you like. Well, it wasn't waste at the time, but what happened, obviously, well, not obviously, but what happened at the time was just a few months before that, or even a year before that, there was talk of modernizing, and well, they use the word modernizing, but also to digitalize the port. And Lebanon, for example, in Lebanon, 2 of its largest exports are scrap copper and iron. So there's been a big eye towards that. So I just wonder if we're thinking globally at different sites or points whereby we can start thinking about the movements of waste or recyclables, you know, what role can we, how can we then think about platform economies within that particular space?
I'm not sure if, I mean, yeah, I followed the Lebanon story to some extent. I mean, I think what you, I don't know if I would want to necessarily give like a prescription of how to study them, because as I said, I really want to be at the analytical level of the concrete and the material, right? So I think those should be driving how you pursue this. But one thing that, to your question of how we should conceptualize capitalism, I mean, I think how we conceptualize any concept of the economy, which we tended to conceptualize as value production and value circulation, etc. And I think maybe what we should do is conceptualize the economy as a place where value begets waste, waste begets waste, waste begets value. So this much more complex kind of interconnections, and that's particularly true with the kind of scrap metals that you're talking about. I think there's also the question of how these then get mixed. Gabrielle Hecht has a very interesting new research study where she focuses on how mining waste from South Africa is shipped to the Bay Area in San Francisco, where they hose it down to get rid of the radiation. And then that radiation gets dispersed in the Bay Area that's already, you know, overly polluted. So again, just go to the level of the concrete, the material, to see how these things mingle in material, but also in terms of value in different places. Yeah.
Thank you. We are running a little bit short of time, but Dario, we open up.
Yes. Very shortly, thank you very much for this argument about all the speech, of course, but in particular this methodological nationalism that I have to say very often stuck me in my research, because there is also a problem about the methodologies of those officials that have to account for the national waste flows. In other times in Italy, for example, we have 4 different methods to account how recycling works and how this performance could be visualized. And so this is a challenge, first of all. Then about the transnational waste regime. Yes, this is convincing. Maybe national states are influencing the speed ratio of the flows, the transnational flows. I'm thinking to China, for example, that just a couple of years ago stopped completely the incoming plastic and cardboard waste. In a way, they were able to change the speed ratio of these flows of materials and values. So maybe national states plays a role, a very huge role sometimes in this kind of movement. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And actually, Saskia Sesson has written about how global capital can also reap added profit from is the juxtaposition of national temporalities with global supranational corporate temporalities. And I think you're absolutely right that there's something there, and I think maybe that requires a little bit more research on our parts. Thank you for that.
To finish off, I saw that Hervé Corvelec has written a question in the chat. Could you maybe you can ask the question, Hervé, and then we.
Yes, thank you very much. I think it's very important, as you do, Zsuzsa, is sort of to focus on the global value chain, and I think that what you are pointing at is something observed by the discrepancy between value chains of production and policies at state levels, and the difficulties of sort of articulating state-based policies, even at the European Union size or United States size, in a world of globalization. But here, I may be surprised when you say that your notion of regime is sort of falling prey for this national view, because I experience it. Now, that's a sayback of a reader. I experience it that it's extremely flexible and definitely allows. The notion of regime for me is really working at the micro scale of the kitchen and the simple bit, and the macro scale. And you can really start with the notion of regime. You can really move up and down and show the connection. So for me, the notion of regime is exactly answering to the challenge that you have. So please don't discard it.
Yeah, no, I hear you, and I mean, you know, it's a definitional question how you define it, and maybe because I want to make an intervention here, maybe I downplay its potential for that kind of flexibility and scalar variability that you point out. So please just take this as a kind of programmatic call for for making it more transnational. But yeah.
Otherwise, just a very final word. I think that what you are right is telling and calling for waste is remind me a lot of the work by Stefano Ponte about global value chains and CSR, where he was really going to show with the chains of coffee and chocolate and wine, or the value of the global companies basically in the north were able to reap the benefits and push down the cost of accreditation, validation, and all this supervision to globally the producer side. And in a way, it's very symmetric. Again, I think that we have a symmetry between wasting and extractivism. The practices of wasting. And I really recommend this, because when I heard you thinking, it was just an echo of his work, which is about extractivism for coffee, chocolate, and wine. And I think it's a very similar, similar dynamic that you are.
I agree that, yeah. And thank you for that reference. I'll be sure to look at it. Yeah, very important. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zsuzsa Gille. Thank you all participants.